Well, good evening. Good to see everybody. Blessed to be here. It was hot and muggy this morning when I got up. It's nice outside right now, isn't it? What happened to all that humidity? I was outside yesterday afternoon, about burned up. Took Baldwin and Benta. We were going to go hiking, but we wanted to make sure that we were back in time to go to Vacation Bible School at 28th Street Monday night. So we stayed here close. We went up Pinnacle Mountain. Yeah. Bad choice. It was some kind of hot. Because, being 60 years old and you got a 13-year-old boy, prime of his life, right? That made me feel pretty good. uh, Good to be here tonight. We are in Romans chapter 4, and what we're going to do tonight is we're going to be reviewing, going through our questions in our book. So if you have that, they'll also be on the screen, but that's where we're going tonight. As far as our sick, all those listed in the bulletin, please keep them in your thoughts and prayers. Do we have any updates on anyone?
Roger's still in the hospital.
Roger's still in the hospital?
Yeah. Baptist 307.
Baptist 307. Okay.
And Mildred's not feeling well, or one is.
Okay, so Roger Spangler in the hospital, Baptist 307, and Mildred, Juanez, both not feeling well. Anyone else we need to mention?
Larry asked normally if you call first, I don't know if that happens.
Okay, but call first.
Yeah, that's all you should call first.
Yeah. Patsy and Larry Billings is who Brent's talking about.
I think they said that since they were working on cancer for a while, but what he said was just to hold it back in so
Yeah.
it's just so much pain you really can't move around.
Yeah. And he's been struggling with that for years, but it's much worse. So, and Patsy's not in good health either. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, nobody's been able to get a hold of Brother Malone. Keep him in your prayers. Continue to try, I guess. See if he's okay. Any other updates? Good to pass that information along. And tonight, Brent's got the invitation, and Brother Thornhill has the song, the invitation song tonight. Before we begin our Bible study, let's start with a prayer. And James, if you don't mind, would you direct our minds in our opening prayer? And James, would you get our closing prayer tonight?
Dear Father in heaven, we're truly thankful that we have this time to be together. Thank you for all the blessings you give us in this life, for life itself. We're more grateful for the spiritual blessings that we have through the sacrifice of your Son, the great love that you've shown toward us. We're thankful that we can be your children through the sacrifice that he made, and we can have every spiritual blessing, including this privilege to pray to you, call you our Father. We pray that you be with us as we come together to study your word, and be with all the teachers of all the classes. Pray that we'd have a mind to learn your will and give us the wisdom and the strength to make the right application of your word to our lives so that we might do your will. We pray that we would examine ourselves and see where we measure in comparison to your wonderful and perfect Son, but also your perfecting Son, so that we can be made perfect through forgiveness, once again, with a better understanding of the terribleness of our sin and repenting of it, and you giving us a new start, that we might be more like Jesus each day. We pray that we might be forgiven, and that we also learn to forgive others and come to know you better through experiencing all those things that Jesus went through, so that we might be formed into his image in all that we do, in all that we say, and especially all that we think, that leads to all those words and actions. Be in harmony with your will. We're thankful for your mercy and your long suffering with us, because we need that every day. And we pray that we might show that toward others as well. That others will see the love of your Son and your love abiding in us, and us living it out in our lives, that they would be drawn to your word, ask about the reason for the hope within us, that we be ready to give an answer. We pray for the congregation here. We pray for those that are not able to be here, that want very much to be here. Pray that you give them strength, opportunity to be here again, and pray that you would be with those that are going through cancer treatments, be with those that have lost loved ones recently. We pray that we might be instruments of your mercy and compassion in physical needs and spiritual needs for those within the congregation here, and others as well in our that are around us, with whom we interact all the time. We pray that we would represent your Son, wear his name in a way that we bring glory and honor to him, thereby giving glory and honor to you. We thank you, and we ask you for all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Thank you. All right. Romans chapter 4, as we, yes. Oh, no. What? Eddie Malone, when's the services, or when were they? Nobody? I don't know. I don't know any of his family. Mm-mm. Well, sure hate to hear that. I hate even more that we weren't made aware of it. So, we'll keep them, the family, in your prayers. Again, I don't know any of them. Shock. All right. Also, yeah, Highway 79 in Pine Bluff is having a vacation Bible school this week. The last night of it will be tomorrow night. It runs through tomorrow night. Ashton spoke on Monday, and I'm scheduled to speak in Pine Bluff tomorrow night. So if you're able to get down to Pine Bluff, I'm sure they would appreciate you supporting them, encouraging them. Okay. Romans chapter 4. Question number 1. What two important personalities in Judaism are cited in this chapter? Abraham and David. Okay? Abraham, the father of the faithful. King David. By the way, both of these individuals, it's interesting, Harvey and Mustafa were having a Bible study before Bible class tonight, and question came up about the seed promise and everything. And of course, David was the one through whom the seed was promised to come. To thy seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis chapter 12. Well, it's interesting. David was also one through whom there was a seed promise. In fact, the seed for both Abraham and David were who? Was who? Jesus. Both of them. Very prominent people in the minds of the Jew. Number 2, fill in the missing words from the central quote in this chapter regarding Abraham. From Genesis 15, verse 6. Okay, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Okay, this text is also quoted in other places in the New Testament. Paul quotes it in Galatians, and James quotes it in James chapter 2. And we've talked about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. Number 3, what is the main root word for the family of Greek words that are translated just, righteous, justification, or righteousness? D-I-K-E, okay? Decay, like tooth decay, that's how you pronounce it, but decay, okay? Diakonos, and some other forms of that term. What was the false god the Greeks associated with this name? As translated as justice, but that the word justice, righteousness, all these terms are from the same Greek word or family of words, and we defined that term earlier in our study. What does the word righteousness mean as it is applied in this chapter in regard to Abraham? What does it mean that Abraham was counted as righteous? He was right with the Lord. Yeah, it is a legal description. He stood right with God. Are the words righteousness and justification different words in Greek? Actually, no, they're not. In fact, the same Greek word translated righteous here in Romans chapter 4 and verse 3, and you compare that to James chapter 2 and verses 24, 26, it's exactly the same word. And Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, same word. So both are from the same family of words. They're different forms, nouns, verbs, but they mean the same thing. What are 2 ways that the concepts of righteousness and justification can be used in the New Testament? Okay. Okay. Reference to one's legal status. So one's behavior, right behavior, and one's legal status before God. Number 6, which of these 2 terms, uses of the terms righteousness and justification, does Paul use in Romans 4? Okay. One's legal status before God. Which of these 2 uses of the terms righteousness and justification does James use in James 2? One's behavior is expected by God. But I do want to make this point. Don't want to pick on Kyle too much, but the idea in both of these texts, the word righteousness, Abraham was declared right before God. Abraham was declared right before God in James chapter 2 as well. Same idea, same concept. The difference isn't so much in the way that the term righteousness is used as it is as the term works is being used in the two contexts. James is using the term works in James chapter 2 in reference to obedience of faith. Paul is using the term works in reference to merit or deserving by virtue of law keeping, deserving something. And that's the main distinction. It's in how the term works is being used and the way the term faith is being used in both these contexts. Paul is talking about the system of justification, faith, the gospel itself, whereas James is talking more about one's subjective faith, his belief, his faith. So both of those terms, faith and works, are being used differently in Romans 4 and James 2. Thus, the whole point being, they're not contradicting one another. They're actually both teaching the same thing. They're just talking about different subjects. Because in Romans chapter 4, as we'll note, Abraham demonstrates the kind of faith that saves. That's exactly what James is saying as well. So, had God's declaration that Abraham's belief was accounted as righteousness come before or after the covenant of circumcision? Before. Okay. The statement that Abraham was counted as righteous is found in Genesis 15 and verse 6. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. The command to be circumcised didn't come along until Genesis chapter 17. So that, by the way, is a key point in Paul's argumentation. He's arguing that justification is not dependent upon circumcision. The Jews were demanding that the Gentiles be circumcised in order to be saved. So Paul is undercutting that idea, the Jewish argument, the Jewish concept.
It was like at least 13 years at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
Between time that he was justified on the basis of his faith, and then circumcision came along with at least 13 years.
Right.
Very least.
In fact, I would argue that Genesis 15 and verse 6 is not Abraham's initial point of justification either. Just because it says in Genesis 15 and verse 6 that Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Well, what about in Genesis chapter 12 when God made the promise to him? Was Abraham justified then? Was he right with God? When he left his homeland of Ur of the Chaldees, was he justified? Was he right with God? I mean, you go back to Genesis chapter 12 all the way through until you get to Genesis 15. What is Abraham doing? He's wandering through the land and offering sacrifices, worshiping God. That's the kind of man Abraham was. And Abraham had already made the promise in Genesis chapter 12 that through thy seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. So I think that's an important point to make as well. What does Paul call the sign of circumcision in this text? Oh, wait a minute. I didn't get my motion all done here. Whoops. Goes all the way back to the beginning. What does Paul call the sign of circumcision in this text? Okay, it's the seal of righteousness of the faith, and that is found there in verse 11. Of course, that's not the end of it, but the seal of righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised. He was a man of faith, a man of godliness, And when God said do something, he simply did it because he believed God. That's the kind of faith that Abraham had. According to Paul, what determines whether someone is a child of Abraham? Okay. He must have the same faith as Abraham. Notice in verse 12, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. What if you don't walk in the same steps as Abraham? You're not justified like Abraham. Well, what does it mean to walk in the steps of faith like Abraham?
It's pretty simple. God told him to do it, he did.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he didn't question. You know, he got other people to follow with him. It's just an example of following what God told him to do and have others do it with him.
That's right. So when Abraham left his homeland and did what God said, when he circumcised himself and all of his males in his household, even when he offered Isaac on the altar in Genesis 22, each of those points, I mean, here you see Abraham demonstrating his faith. And I'll say to you, he was, yes, justified by faith. And we are too. Romans 5 and verse 1. We are justified by faith. What kind of faith? Harvey?
That brings up the point because Mustafa brought up a really good point when we were studying. And he said, well, why are you just supposed to do what God says? The thing is, when we say it that way, it's when you hear other people say, this is what God says. The next person around the block over there who wears a robe or whatever, they're saying what God said. That's not what God says. The word is what God says.
Yeah.
You know, it's his word which has been confirmed. It's been confirmed by history and teaching and everything. It's the written word.
Mhm.
That's what God says. It's up to us to understand it.
Yep. So when God said, leave your home, Abraham did it. I want to say to you, that's faith. When God said for him to be circumcised and he did it, that's faith. Yeah. And can you separate faith from obedience or obedience from faith? I mean, when Paul says, you know, we must walk in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, what he's saying is we have to have the same kind of faith Abraham had. And it is true we're justified by faith. And it is only through faith that we will be and can be justified. What kind of faith? A walking, obedient, submissive faith. That's the faith that saves. And whatever we do in our submission to God's instruction to us, if we do it because we believe that God is right, that God is true, that God will keep his promises to please him, we're doing it by faith. That is faith. What does Paul teach does not exist if there is no law? No sin, transgression. Okay, where there is no law, there is no transgression. Which, by the way, proves, as we talked about when we were in verse 15, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Did Adam and Eve sin? Yeah. So what does that imply? What existed? Everyone's been under law. Adam and Eve was under law. And that was a very simple law. Thou shalt not eat of that tree. That was law. And when they broke that law, they sinned. That's what sin is. Where there is no law, there is no transgression. Now, for the Gentiles, they were never under the law of Moses, but they were still under law. There's always been law, but okay, now let's say that we take, and this is going to be Paul's continuing argument, okay, in regard to the law, because the Jews, they place their confidence in the law and law keeping, in the law of Moses in particular. And he's going to argue in chapter 7 that the law's been done away with. Okay, and of course, he's also answering objections through this entire section. When you get into chapter 5, he starts answering objections. One of those objections is, well, Paul, if the law has been done away with, then we can continue in sin. Because after all, actually, if you take away the law, there is no sin. But wait a minute, can we still sin today? Now, are we under the law of Moses? No, but can there be sin today? All right. Why? The new covenant. We're under law to Christ. We're under law, the law of the Spirit, Romans 8 and verse 2. So, yes, there is still law. We're still under law. So keep that in mind. And number 11, explain the phrase, who contrary to hope, in hope believed. Okay. Contrary to hope.
Well, Brooks says, he's over 100 years old, and the Peruvian time, and they lived that long, they didn't have babies when you didn't have children real long. In spite of that, he believed. In spite of what seemed like he wouldn't hope for, he hoped for it anyway.
And as Annie said, you trust God, you trust God, regardless of how impossible it may appear or seem, or actually be from a natural perspective. Harvey?
I didn't hear you say that, but yeah. Sarah's womb couldn't have children at the time.
That's right.
And Abraham, she couldn't have. But he believed anyway.
He believed anyway. Despite, contrary to hope, contrary to what he would naturally expect to happen, he believed anyway. So, as it also states in regard to this very point, God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who contrary to hope, in hope believe, it was naturally impossible for this to happen. But Abraham believed it anyway. And in response to that, he was circumcised.
You think about all the things he's been asked to do. Like, we sometimes rate, oh, this is going to be tough, this is going to be tougher, this is going to be, everything
Toughest.
he was asked to do. Leave and go somewhere you don't know where you're going. Circumcise yourself. Take your only son and sacrifice him. Your wife who is passed. Think about everything. And so when you think about it, contrary to hope and hope believed, everything he was asked to do, it's hard to see yourself doing those things. And so that's where you had to have that hope that God would follow through.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about, okay, all the things that were very hard for him to do. There were commands associated with each of those promises. And in regard to the command to be circumcised, there was the promise of Sarah having a son, and you should call his name Isaac. That was naturally impossible, but Abraham trusted God. He believed that God meant what he said, would do what he promised. But then notice for Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 17. And this refers to the last point. And, how hard would it be for you to offer as a sacrifice your only son or daughter, for that matter? How hard would that be?
It's kind of an unparalleled thing because Abraham had the promise that, as we have pulled up, that all nations would be blessed through Isaac. So he knew Isaac would be alive, even though he was supposed to sacrifice.
And that is the kicker. That's the idea.
Verse
Yeah.
19.
Yeah.
Verse 19. That's where Abraham was strong, was in verse 19.
Absolutely. He knew God was going to do what he promised, even though the command was offer this son through whom that promise was going to be fulfilled.
What had God demonstrated to Abraham that showed that he was able to raise his son? There was something there. He had precedent there, wasn't he? So,
The birth of Isaac was
The-
proof.
The birth of Isaac was
Making a life, give life to them.
right. It's impossible.
Yeah, I think he said that the proof that he actually bore a son in his old age, gave him all the information. He had basically one every single day, hundreds of babies all over the world, right? The fact that his wife in her old age was able to bear a son, he knew God was not going to just leave that for nothing.
That's right. And it's interesting. God didn't start with the command in dealing with Abraham. He didn't start with a command to offer his only son. He started with leave home. He started then, by giving him a promise, and then telling him something a little more difficult to do. Circumcision. That's not easy either. That's not something fun to do. I'm sure it was something that he didn't want to do, but yet God said do it in view of the promise of Isaac. So God, can you see God kind of bringing Abraham along as well and teaching him and showing himself faithful? God showing himself faithful to Abraham. And Abraham's growing in his faith as time goes by.
The sad part about that is that he did the same thing with Israel, but Israel never learned. They never came around in faith. And they perished in the wilderness.
Exactly right.
You know, we have the new covenant, and we're told to go, therefore, and teach. Okay, go wherever we're supposed to go. And then when Jesus, he said, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. I mean, we're to do the exact same thing. Go and teach, baptize, and then take up your cross, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. It's the same. It's the sacrificial life that we're supposed to be living, and that's something we have to do a check on every day.
That's right. And you mentioned verse 19 here, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Abraham had the knife ready. He was going to go through with it. In Abraham's mind, Isaac was dead. So that's the kind of faith that Abraham had. So Abraham and Sarah were past the age of having children, but he believed anyway. God's going to do what he promised. And by the way, in Genesis chapter 17, there's a discussion between Abraham and God. Who is Abraham wanting to have the seed promise fulfilled through? Ishmael. Well, why can't Ishmael? Well, that wasn't God's plan. God had chosen that it would be through Abraham and Sarah, through Isaac, that the seed would come, and that all nations of the earth be blessed. In fact, the next the next generation, okay, Isaac and Rebekah are going to they have twins. You got Jacob and Esau. But God made a choice there. Through whom would that seed be fulfilled? Through Jacob. Paul gets to that in Romans chapter 9. Of what was Abraham fully convinced? Okay? God's going to keep his promise. God would do exactly as he had promised. When God said that, no, it's not going to be through Ishmael, you're going to have a son. About a year from now, you and Sarah are going to have a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Abraham believed God. So God's going to do exactly what he said, and that passage there in Romans chapter 4, verse 21, is a very telling passage as far as Abraham is concerned. In fact, back up to verse 20 where he says he did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God. Now see, when we trust God and we do what he says, who do we glorify? There are some who have this idea, and it's been planted by false teachers. It's been planted that when you do this stuff, then you're glorifying yourself. If I'm doing it because God said to do it, who am I glorifying? I'm glorifying God. And so Abraham was strengthened in faith, giving glory to God, being fully convinced that what he had promised, he was also able to perform. And therefore it was accounted to him for righteousness. That's the kind of faith Abraham had. Is that the kind of faith we have?
That's kind of a principle of use it or lose it. We were talking about in our class last Sunday morning. He had faith. He used the faith that he had, and because in the wording in Romans 4, they talk about being not weak in faith. He used that faith, and then he was strengthened in the faith because he's
That's
using
right.
the faith that he has, and that's what Daniel did. That's what we all need to do. Keep growing.
We're to be growing.
Use what we have.
What does Paul teach? What does Paul teach was not written for Abraham alone? Okay, and the righteousness that comes through faith, just like with Abraham, that it is not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him. What was imputed to him? His righteousness on account of his faith. God counted Abraham as righteous because of Abraham's faith. So, yes.
The answer I think you're looking for is his example encourages us because we can see the fruit of it.
And that's, yeah, definitely true.
Us to follow his faith.
And all of these examples, you turn back to Romans chapter, or Hebrews chapter 11. All these men of faith. We made this point last Wednesday night. We think of these people in Hebrews chapter 11 as superheroes, superhuman, They were just normal people like us.
Just that statement, it also shows that everybody should have come to that same conclusion, that Paul expresses in words and writes them down here. If the Jews would have used the same logic that Paul did, they would realize that this has always been the case, that we need to have faith in God, and God will consider us righteous on the basis of that faith. But it was a hard thing for them to understand when they had the law and they were thinking, they focused on the law keeping and it didn't even focus on the traditions on how not to break the law. All those loopholes.
And the point you make, James, about, Abraham, that they should have known this. They should have understood this principle because everyone who has ever been right in God's sight is right in God's sight through the same process, through faith. I don't care whether you're talking about Enoch or, go back before that. What about Abel? Go to Hebrews chapter 11. What about Abel? How was he justified? By faith, right? Enoch, he walked with God. He was not, for God took him. Then you've got the example of Noah. Noah was justified by faith, wasn't he? When was Noah justified by faith? Huh? When he obeyed. Yeah. You got all those examples, Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob, Joseph. You got all these examples. The children of Moses, the children of Israel. All of these things are written for our learning. You jump ahead to Romans chapter 15, verse 4, right? These things are written for our learning. So why does Paul teach that Jesus was delivered up? because of our offenses, because of our sin. That ties into Matthew 28 or 26, verse 28. What, I mean, he died because of our sin. Why does Paul teach that Jesus was raised up? Oops, I did it again. Because of our justification. What is that? I think it may be something we need to talk about just a second, though. He was delivered up on account of our offenses, and he was raised up on account of our justification. He wasn't raised up because we had already been justified, though, right? Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Receive his son back as a symbolically when he obeyed and offered the son up as a sacrifice. And as Jesus was offered up as a sacrifice, so he also receive that same.
What we really need to get out of this is, okay, Jesus was delivered up on account of our offenses. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly, Romans 5 and verse 8. And Jesus was raised up on account of our justification. That is, so that we could become justified, right?
We can say our need for justice.
Yeah, because for our need. That's exactly right. Our need for salvation. You use that term. Salvation from death. But in fact, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 21, Peter says, baptism also now saves us, not the putting away the filth of the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The resurrection of Jesus Christ was absolutely necessary. If Jesus had not been raised from the dead, what hope would we have? Yes, Jesus had to die, but he also had to be raised. Our raising up is after the similitude of his being raised up. Harvey?
Yeah. It's conquering of death. He did it.
Yeah.
He left his body behind and then went back into his body and it lived. And so he did it. He conquered it.
And what Paul is getting at in all of this is that we need Jesus. Okay? We need what Jesus did for us. We need what Jesus accomplished. We need to gain victory through him. That's the only way we can gain victory. You cannot gain victory over sin and over death through keeping the law. Can't do it. Just because you're born a Jew, you're a descendant of fleshly Abraham, what does that get you? Who do you need? You need Jesus. That is Paul's point. Without Jesus' sacrifice and without his resurrection, we would have no hope. He continues to build on that throughout the book, though. And that point will be emphasized over and over again. Any thoughts, comments, questions on chapter 4 before we move on? Yes, Harvey?
Say one more, continue on what I just said. He conquered death. He did it with his spirit, he did it physically.
Mhm.
But in our hearts, he did it emotionally. He did it the only way it could really be done. He's not forcing anyone to become a Christian. We're all volunteers, and he conquered death in our life when we accept him and change. That's the conquering right there.
And that's the gospel message. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as Paul says in Romans chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, you're the servants to whomsoever you yield yourselves servants to obey, whether sin unto death or obedience unto righteousness. God be thanked that you have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered to you, being then made free from sin. You become the servants of righteousness. They had obeyed that form of doctrine. baptism is like the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. Baptism is the form. And so, all right, out of time. Appreciate it. Anything else?
John, number 279, he was able to deliver.
279. If you want to use your song books, Brother Thornhill will be leading us in our song tonight after Brent gives us the invitation. Okay. Is everybody back in here? Benny's not here to make the announcements tonight, so it was brought to our attention before class tonight. Tony found um, in the paper, I guess, and online, Eddie Malone passed away, and that was a shock, and it is a shock to all of us. We had not heard that. So I don't know if anybody knows any of his family, any way to contact any of his family. If you do, let us know. But certainly need to keep the family in our prayers, and just a shock. So also we've got a couple in the hospital. Roger Spangler's in the hospital, Baptist, and I wrote that down. And 307 Baptist 307. Also, Sister Juanez and Sister Mildred both are not feeling well tonight, not able to get out and be with us. We have several others that are in the bulletin that we certainly do need to keep in our prayers. Also, it was mentioned that Larry and Patsy Billings certainly would appreciate visits or cards or calls, but please call them first. And I think that probably holds true with most people who are sick and not feeling well. Make sure that you contact them before you do visit them, but certainly do contact them and do what we can to encourage them. Are there any others that we need to mention? Yes. Okay, business meeting notes are on the corner of the table over here. Also, the charts, I didn't find out till after services last Sunday evening that the charts that I printed out only had half of the charts. The back page was empty. It's supposed to have charts on the back side too. So all of the charts are now over there on the table, and I've got more copies, and I'll be glad to make more copies for anybody who wants one. So that's available over there as well. Anything else that we need to mention? Okay, turn it over to Brent.
Evening. If y'all want to turn over 1 Corinthians 1 in a minute here, I'll look at that. up here, I was supposed to give the invitation. You're giving the invitation. I guess one of the first things to reflect on is what exactly is I'm supposed to be inviting y'all to. Have you ever all gotten one of those phone calls on your cell phone? You look at it's got blocked number, or you don't recognize the number. I'm not going to answer that. You ever got one of those emails in your somehow it gets through your spam filter? It says you're invited to join, and delete. Not even going to open that. Never happened to any of y'all? Oh, I mean, I do that all the time. And if you're going to be invited to do something, I'll get around to that in a second. But before, if you're going to accept an invitation, you probably want to know what it is you're going to be invited to do ahead of time. You don't want to just accept any old invitation that comes your way. You want to know who's inviting you and why they're inviting you and what they're inviting you for. Remember, old Twilight Zone commercial about the whole thing about the cookbook, how to serve men. At the end, one guy's trying to yell at everybody else, "It's a cookbook!" They're not trying to. You got invited to dinner, yeah, and you're the main course. Yeah, no, we don't want that. So, what are we exactly inviting people to? And if we say we're giving an invitation, what are we inviting people to? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. For it hath been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you that saith, I am of Paul, and I have Apollos, and I have Cephas, and I have Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you but Crispus and Gaius. Lest any should say that I baptized in my own name. I baptized also the household of Stephanus. Besides, I don't know whether I baptized any other. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of no effect. A little over 30 years ago, I was studying in a philosophy class. Had to take a philosophy class to graduate at Delta State over in Cleveland, Mississippi. And the professor got up and he did went all the way around in the room, wanted to, each and every one of us. He asked, "Okay, so what religion are you? What are you religiously?" Some people say, "I'm Baptist, some say I'm Methodist, some are Presbyterian." You can tell you were really in the Mississippi Delta because nobody said Catholic. So, so he gets around to me, and I'm Christian, and some of my classmates kind of laugh, ha ha ha. Yes, I'm a Christian, and well, what kind are you? And and I know people say, well, I'm a church Christer. I now you laugh, but I tell you, I know people who say that. I'm a church Christer. I go to church Christ. That's the kind of Christian I am. Well, I decided whatever my invitation is tonight, it's not for you to be a church of Christer. Not a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran or a Roman Catholic or Orthodox either. But that's not what what I want to invite anybody to do. And I reflected on that a little bit more. And you look at this. Quit giving me that look. All right, you look at this a little bit more, and and Paul's talking to them here about, and he says divisions, and the word he uses there is the word that we translate actually schisms. I believe is the correct translation. Isn't it? Schismatos. All right. Well, I thought you just know off the top of your head. Yeah. Okay. But schisms, and they were dividing up into groups, and they were labeling themselves and each other. And you're that one, and I'm this one, and you're the other one, and who knows what he is. And they were dividing themselves. And we can still, and we do still do that today. And when I'm inviting you to do something, it's not to join any one particular sect or group over any other. I don't want you to join a sect. I don't want you to join a group. What I want you to do is to be a Christian, and not a hyphenated Christian. Even within the church, we still sometimes, oh, well, are you a member of a liberal or a conservative church? Well, I'm a member of the Church of Christ, but not the church belonging to Christ. But I'm not inviting you to become a liberal or a conservative Christian.
I'm inviting you to become just a Christian and nothing else. Now, when we start doing this, and I realize that there are different things that we disagree with different people. And by the way, there's different things that I disagree with some of y'all in here, and you, me, and everybody else back and forth also. None of us agree probably on everything we believe in here. In this building right now, I doubt that there are very many of us who believe every single thing exactly the same way everybody else does. And we can use that and start dividing up into parties. And I talked to a fellow recently. I've heard this before. Well, I know I'm right, so I can prove what I believe because I know I'm right. I don't. I know God is right. I know this is right. Now, what I believe about it, I might be wrong. I might be mistaken. And so I'm not inviting you to believe something just because I or anyone else here says it. I'm inviting you to believe what this says, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that he was literally physically born of a virgin miraculously, that he lived here as one of us but without sin and died on the cross for our sins. That's what I'm inviting you to believe. I'm not inviting you to join a sect. I'm inviting you to believe that. I'm inviting you to repent, knowing that who Christ is and what he did for us and what he continues to do for us and what he's able to do for us going forward. That you will have a much better eternity following him than if you don't. I'm inviting you to repent and to follow him. I'm inviting you to confess him as the Son of God. I'm inviting you to be buried with him in water for the remission of sins, not to join a denomination, but simply to obey him in faith, because he said, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. Not to join the Baptist or the Methodist or the Church of Christ denomination. None of those. Simply to do it out of faithful obedience to Christ. And then the Lord knows his own and adds to the church daily those who are being saved. Don't say, I'm going to be this kind of Christian or that kind of Christian. I'm a member of this type of group or that type of group. Just be just a Christian. That's what we're inviting you to. Nothing more, nothing less. If there's anyone here this evening who can help, we ask that you come forward now.
Grandest thing through the ages run, 'tis the grandest thing for a mortal tongue. 'Tis the grandest thing that the world has sung. Our God is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver thee. He is able to deliver
go to our Heavenly Father. Our Father, which art in heaven, we thank you for allowing us once again to assemble here to study and investigate your bad and holy word. We thank you for teachers, calling tonight. Thank you for Don McClain and Don McClain. We pray you continue to bless us, help us to look at ourselves, examine ourselves, those things we know we need to make the necessary change in our life. We pray you will do it too late. We pray that the word is called, we will not only hear your word, but we apply it to our life. That we be doers of the man and holy word. That we be able to be examples for others. We be able to reach out and teach and help others. We continue to pray for those in this congregation that you will forgive them and sick, that you continue to bless them. We pray that you extend your grace and your mercy toward us, Heavenly Father, as we on this journey to do what's right and all you do to your will. I pray especially for Eddie and home family, that you will comfort that family. Pray that the Father will do whatever all we can in order to get in touch, do what we can, and brothers and sisters in Christ, and all reach out and help that family. Thank you for being so good, so kind, so merciful to us. As you forgive us for the sins we committed, Lord, so whether it be word, thought, or deed, even those that trespass against us. We pray that Father, you give us the same way you give us that Father. Pray for this congregation to help us to find our forces together, help us to look out for one another, help us to put others before ourselves, help us, Heavenly Father, to do what's right in order to watch over